I take great pleasure in introducing today's guest, Professor Sanjib Baruah, who will engage in a conversation with some of us on his newly published book, In the Name of the Nation, India and its Northeast. So apart from myself, the two other interlocutors for today's session are Joyita Das and Kairavi Acharya, master students of the discipline of Humanities and Social Sciences at IIT Gandhinagar. Sanjibda, I extend my welcome to you from Dialogues and from IIT Gandhinagar. Thank you very much for agreeing to speak for us, and hearty congratulations to you on this wonderful work. Let me begin by saying a few words about Professor Baruah's research. Professor Sanjib Baruah is a professor of political studies at Bard College, New York. He has worked extensively on issues of identity politics in the Northeast. Some of his earlier publications include India Against Itself, Assam and the Politics of Nationality, which was published in 1999, then Durable Disorder, Understanding the Politics of Northeast India, which was published in 2005, and the edited volumes Beyond Counterinsurgency, Breaking the Impasse in Northeast India, which was published in 2009. So In the Name of the Nation is the latest in a long series of books and articles authored by Professor Baruah. It is a fascinating book that takes the readers down to some of the most recent happenings in the region, such as the agitation against the Citizenship Amendment Act, the Government of India's accord with the NSCN-IM, and so on. Professor Baruah has always dealt with very contemporary themes. And in some of his earlier works, he discussed issues such as the making of the Bodo identity, the nature of Alpha's war of liberation, and so on. In the Name of the Nation as well, he offers many fresh insights into contemporary politics in the Northeast and the relationship between the region and Delhi, as well as between the region and the rest of India. The book contains a very insightful chapter on the making of Northeast India as an administrative category in the 1970s, the impact of the partition of India on Assam, the dynamics of the recently concluded Naga Peace Accord, counterinsurgency operations of the post-colonial nation state, and the questionable means adopted by the state in liquidating the Alpha, and so on. In between, he also talks about how Northeast India has emerged as a resource frontier post the independence, and all that it entails. So these are some entirely new thrusts in his prolonged intellectual and academic relationship with the Northeast. He's one of those rare political scientists who tries to look at the historical trajectory of an event or process. And he has in his earlier works looked at the impact of colonial rule in creating artificial boundaries between the hills and the plains, leading to the fostering of hard mental boundaries. In this work as well, he considers the role of historical circumstances in inducing Northeast India's current predicaments. The additional dimension that In the Name of the Nation brings to us is the light it sheds on the culpability of the post-colonial nation state in alienating the Northeast. The failure of the post-colonial state's promise to grant democracy to its citizens. By closely examining the life of the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, or AFSPA, in the region, the book questions the nation's commitment towards the people of a region it regards as an integral part of itself. I have a few questions for Sanjibda based on my reading of the book. Part of my questions are meant to encourage Professor Baruah to talk about the book, and part of the questions would be genuine queries based on my own reading of the book. To begin with, I would like to request you, Sanjibda, to say a few words about the book. In particular about the plan of the book, your purpose in writing another book on the region, given that you have written extensively in the past about the region. So why another book, and what is new about this one? We would like to hear from you to begin with.
Thank you very much. Well, I apologize again to everybody. You know what happened, as you know, it's quite early in the morning for me here. And even though I get up early, I left those 15-20 minutes for things like making my cup of tea. So that particularly became more inconvenient than it would have become normally. My apologies. Thank you very much. I'm really delighted to be part of this. And Madhumita, talked about my interest in contemporary stuff. And what's interesting is that this book, you would notice, in fact, so much so that the publishers used the term contemporary history. Wasn't aware that I was a political science person for a while. So, so anyway, so I guess this is a kind of important, I suppose, because unlike many, every book has a history, every book has a particular, you can't really separate it from the people who write those books. For me, really, making sense of Northeast has been something I'm interested in, for a number of reasons. And unlike many other people, I really don't necessarily, say many academics teach about these subjects. Believe it or not, my academic job has nothing to do with my writing. I have a job where I teach political science, political theory, political economy, you know. So this has been really more almost not a, ought to say a side interest, but all I'm saying, it might explain a little bit why my books are a little different, right? Because in a way, I didn't really write a PhD thesis on any of this, right? So that clearly making sense of Northeast has been something that I want, making sense of Northeast and making sense of Northeast India's troubles. And since I read very broadly, so I would say there is a quotation I have at the in my concluding chapter, which is from Paul Villar, a historian of Catalonia, who says that the history of the world can be best observed from the frontier. Right? He's a wonderful historian, so I have read things like that, and I'm always struck by that observation. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that that observation inspired this book. Meaning, I'm not merely interested in Northeast India, I'm interested in why Northeast India went in a direction it did. It has a lot of larger historical issues after all. Don't forget, even though most of us take for granted, the world is divided into 195 odd nation states. But clearly, these things are just kind of I don't see them as just givens of life. So clearly, it seems to me then we have lots of things going on in the world. Think about say the optimism of 1947 in India, that period, and all the discussion these days of failed states failing, right? A lot has changed. So in a way, I felt that I could really make sense of lots of these global things, being from a Northeast Indian lenses. And as you know, right, lots of people theorize, but they know a little provincial world of Europe, right? And from that, they theorize about the world. And there's no reason why we couldn't theorize from Gujarat or Northeast India, for that matter. So in that sense, the book is more ambitious than a book on the Northeast, if you like, right? That's why it has that title, because after all, the whole world had gone through a transition, and we had this wonderful optimistic way of thinking from empire to nation, right? And whether an empire to nation sounded very optimistic in 1950s or 60s. And now when you look at it, I would say there is room for some doubt. So in a way, I'm inviting people to rethink this transition. What really happened? And nothing like a frontier region to think it from, right? So in that sense, the book is different. So I can go into more detail, but I think I'll wait because a number of you'll have questions. So I think if that is enough, I will wait for your next question, or you can pursue this.
I've read the entire book and I really found it fascinating, but I have put together a couple of questions, and then the students will also have the questions for you. So my first question is really about about donor, basically. So in your first chapter, I think you mentioned that the government of India treats the Northeast in a patronizing manner with ill-concealed disdain and despair, as a region that is riddled by unnecessary suspicion towards the rest of India and by its own insurmountable problems arising from its heterogeneous languages and cultures, its surplus resources, its unending saga of migrations, and so on. You humorously refer to the fact that this is the only region to have an entire department catering to its needs, the donor Ministry of Development of Northeastern Region. You criticize the policy discourse underlying the creation of the donor. It treats the region, you say, as a threat to internal security and as a strategic international frontier. Now, this attitude of the central government also underlies the continued operation of the Armed Forces Special Powers Act. Could you please tell the audience about the argument you make here? And my other question to you is this: there is a developmental perspective to the donor as well. If we put the security perspective aside, is there any objection to the developmental logic that drives it, the other side to donor, that is? After all, there is a sense of relation at the local level at the grants that are flowing into the Northeast, and these tend to address the long-held grievance that the region has given more than it has got. So do you also have a critique for the developmental logic that lies behind the creation of donor? That would be my,
Sure. Thank you. Thank you. Listen, first, I'm really not necessarily that interested in people's motives, believe it or not. After all, so I wouldn't want to go for, I wouldn't use a word like disdain. History is full of unintended consequences, right? We all know that. So in some ways, I'm not even sure that these are anybody intended to be this way, right? So in a way, I'm interested in unintended consequences. Just think of this. Why do I take this whole 47 so seriously? After all, clearly the Northeast India, as we know, was a frontier province. Frontier province were structurally different, right? But in India, we are not used to it. In fact, Northeast India is very similar structurally to Northwest frontier province, right? So because it is Pakistan, we somehow don't think like that. And so now just imagine how used we are to think about Northwest frontier province as troubled because of Afghanistan, right? But imagine structurally very similar, same settled areas, excluded area, frontier area, right? So obviously something about this structure is very different. It is very colonial. No, don't forget that colonialism was not about preparing the world for nation states. Right? Clearly, people living in the 1930s believed that this is going to be there forever, right? So obviously, the idea that you will suddenly the place changes, becomes part of a national space, is a huge transition. So the issue is that do we really realize how different it is? Think of this. Say if you think about, say, administered area, excluded area, the whole categories, the Naga imagination of a Naga nationhood goes into administered area, unadministered area, even areas outside of India, right? So it is not irrational at all if you think about the nature of colonial sovereignty. Literally, after all, the huge parts of Northeast India, today's Nepal, there wasn't even a state presence till about the 40s. There was no state presence there, right? So as a result, then it's really a very different kind of a place. So the point is that when we really decide that this is going to be part of India, we're going to govern it, clearly it required very different lenses, right? And in a way, I feel that the lenses were not there. So so just think of this. I'll give you an example, which is not even a very remote area. Digboy in Assam is Asia's oldest oil refinery, right? And so it was very normal to have oil in Assam, right? So it was normal in the 19th century. Suddenly, India becomes independent. The idea whether there should be a refinery in Assam becomes problematic because it's too close to the border. It's a completely new way of thinking, right? So, in fact, right at the beginning, then in the 50s, you would notice tension about whether refinery should be. Right? I mean, what is crazy? The world's oldest refinery was there, and in a way, before Gujarat, since Gujarat is relevant, Assam was India's largest oil producer. Still, independence changes everything, right? So, if you think about it, this is a way of seeing. People keep repeating it's a very sensitive area. There's a little, what do they call it? The kind of a chicken neck. This is really a way of seeing, right? The only partition made the chicken neck. Why keep repeating the same cliches, right? So it seems to me that we framed a particular way, began to look at a particular way, that in a way, these things should be really rethought, right? Is that the best way of thinking? So in a way, then, it's not intention so much as clearly unintended consequences, right? So I see then, I think anybody who's a Democrat, you don't have the Iram Sharmila, should be embarrassed by the fact that we have a law like Armed Forces Special Powers Act in a democracy for 60 years. Why am I to be embarrassed? We are used to it. Precisely because we think you need it. Now, even when you discuss peace, nobody talks about repealing Armed Forces Special Powers Act. I'm just an old-fashioned liberal Democrat who wants these things to be normal. No place in India, no democracy should have a place where you have an Armed Forces Special Powers Act for 60 years. We should all be embarrassed, right? So in a way that I think my attitude is that how did we come to this? Why did it happen? That is basically the way I approach it. Not with intention. Unintended consequences can produce results. And I think a lot of it is that. So one can say, well, wonderful. India has there is a donor, as you point out, the Department of, but there's one way of thinking is wonderful. Another way of thinking, why on earth do we have a department, whole department in Delhi, just to think about Northeast India's development? This is quite absurd after all. I mean, clearly, after all, people should be in charge of their development. Why should Delhi think about what's good for Northeast India? All I'm saying is these things, you can have a reverse gaze, right? Sounds like wonderful, but if you reverse your gaze and think, why on earth this area is so special? Why does it have Armed Forces Special Powers Act? Why does it have a special bureaucracy to deal with its development, right? Nothing should be taken as normal, right? Because in a way, it happened only after independence. Nobody thought it was odd to have a refinery in Assam before that, right? Now we do. So that's basically my way of thinking about it.
I'm just ending up. Sorry, I'm muting myself for, to save the bandwidth and all that. So I said, are you suggesting then, Sanjib, that the donors should be scrapped altogether and the government should go about the whole process of, assisting and sharing grants and sharing funds with the Northeast in a completely different manner, much in the same way that it does with the rest of India? And, then what happens to, as I said, the second part of my question was, there is this feeling that Northeast India has given more in terms of resources to the rest of India than it has got back. So in what way, according to you, can this be done? If I'm not even considering the security perspective, which is all wrong. I completely agree. I was just talking about the developmental logic. What could be an alternative way to go about it? This is going beyond your book, perhaps, but I'm just, since you're there with us, in a way, I would like to hear what you have to say about it.
No, look, nothing is beyond, right? I really write, because in the spirit of sharing ideas, right, to really provoke discussion. Just think of this. Say, after all, the word policy, I myself have a position at Center for Policy Research. When I joined it, my thought was this, right? Clearly, bureaucrats think about policy all the time. India has lots of bureaucrats. Why do you need somebody like me to think about policy, right? Just to repeat what bureaucrats do? What's the point? It seems to me there's some value to somebody like me who reads broadly, who reads historically. If I think about policy, exactly what should the government do? Government is doing counterinsurgency. Yeah, Professor Baruah, tell us a better way of doing counterinsurgency. That's not my job. Intellectuals should not be in that job. So it seems to me, I'm not trying to define policy, right? I'm just trying to think what a mess we have created, right? If the mess we have created, so new ideas of policy will come. But I feel that we are becoming, look, you can become extremely conservative in your intellectual orientation if you constantly think about policy, because then everything is given. Within that, you decide what is policy, right? After all, development, it seems to me, it also needs to be interrogated, right? Clearly, it seems to me now, think of this. You start a nuclear installation, that's a development. You have an oil refinery, it's a development. If you have a healthcare center, it's a development. It's a school, it's a development. It's a university, it's a development. Clearly, it's a completely monstrous term. It doesn't serve anybody to keep saying development. It suits everybody to use that because it sounds like wonderful, right? Because we never critique it. I'm not interested in development. I'm interested in what development does, right? So in a sense, what development does in Gujarat may be very different than what development is doing. So it seems to me, it is not intention. Think about Meghalaya. Why on earth would we have coal plants, little kids going into coal plants and 20 people dying? We can't do a thing about it. Why on earth does it happen? Not be, right. It seems to me precisely because development becomes this wonderful term. It's good for everybody. But literally we have so it seems I try to go beyond it, and I say it is basically a resource frontier. When you think about all those kind of colonial area ideas, excluded areas, right, or say, colonials, when they thought about say how Khasi should be treated differently, Naga should be treated differently, they were not thinking about affirmative action or protective discrimination. They were really they thought that these people are really not good enough to join the market. So those ideas we just continued. Clearly, it is going to affect. What has happened, it seems to me, in recent years is that these colonial area institutions became very handy for when nobody thought in the 19th century that Indian business would be interested in coal from Northeast India. So what has happened? The business, it suited business model perfectly. right? You go and get this coal with under extremely bad conditions. It'll come very cheap so long as you use those colonial era institutions. So what do you do with that? So I want to throw light on that kind of an issue. Not intended, right? But if you take history seriously, this becomes very important. As you know, right, Indian constitution was new, 4050, but a lot of it were continuities. 35 Act is also continuous with the Indian constitution. So we have not given enough attention to this fact, right? That the colonial era institutions continuing it, we just celebrate it, but we always forget that that was not the intention, right? So that when you have inner line and continue the inner line, there are huge effects because inner line started with very different attitudes. So the kind of fresh decolonial thinking that was needed never occurred, right? And I'm inviting younger generation to really be bold enough to think of how to decolonize our imagination, right? So and accept that 47 decolonization was a very tricky decolonization, right? That's the sort of intention I have.
So, Chonchipta, while you are on this, in fact, my next question to you was about the inner line. Now that you have broached it yourself, could you please tell us a little more about the post-colonial imperative in retaining the inner line? You do that in your book, but if you could just explain for the sake of the audience. And my question, I have one question related to this, and I'll ask it right away. See, what you're saying is that when the British left, the post-colonial nation state realized that the people of Northeast India were still not ready enough to mingle with the national mainstream. Hence, they extended the protection that the British had already granted to them in the form of the inner line. But inner line is creating all kinds of other problems. You almost seem to be on the verge of suggesting that it is time to let the inner line wither away. Did I get you wrong? I mean, I just wanted to ask you. And
you have, and look, I think that if you think that all institutions that we have are all we have got, our imagination can't go think beyond it, then you are right. I don't think like that. It seems to be very clear that inner line had a particular purpose, leave the primitives out. Right? And the reason why I have continued it is not what people think it is. Essentially, it seems to me as you know, even before India became independent, at exactly the same time, the Naga rebellion happened, right? So it seems to me the Naga rebellion made it very clear that just because you won power in Delhi doesn't give you the political capital to change Northeast India's regime. So essentially then, a lot of the colonialists continued, not because they wanted to continue. You did not have the political capital to change it, right? So, and that unless we accept it, we are in trouble, right? So clearly they are not meant for what we are trying to use them for, right? Which is why you really have the kind of exploration of coal that you have in Meghalaya, right? And clearly it is also, we have to be bold enough to criticize, right? Clearly it's become very suitable. You're really, almost every one of those states, as if you like, number of those states, which are all excluded area, partially excluded area, right? Clearly they have a very particular kind of political regime, right? And regimes are, if you look at how their assemblies are constituted, right? It's very clear that vast majority of the people, the members of the assembly are of a particular group. Others are not, right? Does it mean we just continue this forever? Clearly, because of our political incapacity, we had to have those institutions. It seems to me now we need to at least think, what is the downside of these institutions? In some ways, you have entirely new kind of sub-citizenship, new kind of subordination. All of these are developing precisely because we haven't done anything about those institutions. So you can't clearly, without creating a consensus, without having a discussion, clearly, when you suddenly withdraw something, it'll probably be another rebellion, right? But the main problem is a kind of a problem of poverty of imagination, right? We haven't even thought about what these institutions are about. What were they doing? What kind of a function does it have now? We just assume that they must be having a good function, right? But look at it. I mean, Meghalaya to me doesn't seem like a good function. Really, clearly there is, in some ways, look at it another way, that it seems to me that, when you think about, say, many of you are interested in environment. When you think about the destruction of, say, forests in Amazon, or destruction of forests in Indonesia for palm oil cultivation, right? Clearly, we are all aware that it meant huge destruction, environmental, lots of local people lost access to it, right? So this process then is essentially that I don't like to use the word indigenous people very much because could be indigenous, could be not indigenous. But essentially, human beings really human beings made a living out of a landscape. The landscape is not a resource. You make a living, right, from it. And over time, those resources get taken out by corporations, etc. That become a resource that you use, right? That's not automatic, nothing natural about it. To a political process that happens. So the political process in India maybe we didn't have military dictators like in Indonesia to take this land and make them into palm cultivation. Our process may have been more democratic, but the consequences are not great, right? And precisely because we have never critiqued these institutions, right? And because everything has been mediated through these institutions, right? So development has been development mediated through these colonial institutions, which has a whole set of consequences, which have been very bad, right? So, which has been, ultimately, I'm an old-fashioned Democrat. I want people to be part of it, right? I think, after all, why use the word development? We are all interested in human well-being. Human well-being is not only about how much money you're making, we all know that. Let's use old-fashioned terms. Is it promoting more human well-being? The answer is no. Is it making a few people rich? Yes, right? So those are the issues I'm getting young people to ask. And you need fresh lenses, you need to critique old categories. Only then you can ask fresh questions and come up with fresh ideas. And I am not giving the ideas. I'm just inviting you to think differently.
Yeah, I understand. I think the key lies in decolonizing the mind, as you've very rightly pointed out, creating conditions for having more conversations. These are some of the takeaways from what you're saying. I think I'll just quickly proceed to the next question before I ask my students to ask their share of questions. This one is about the agitation, Citizenship Amendment Act, and NRC and all that. In fact, I find the chapter Partition's Long Shadow in your book, the chapter Partition's Long Shadow, Nation and Citizenship, to be very timely. So much has been written about the NRC, and yet there is so little clarity on the matter. And your chapter, maps out the entire historical trajectory of the citizenship debate. The colonial history of migration from East Bengal, the post-partition cross-border immigration, the Assam movement, the Assam Accord, the agitation against IMDT, illegal migrants determination by tribunal act, for the sake of the audience, the Supreme Court injunctions, all of it. And it just lays out the broad historical canvas, makes it easy for the readers to comprehend the local, why the local people were supporting NRC. And yet, in your book, you point out the flaws of the NRC exercise, the disenfranchisement that happened in its wake, the Hindu cultural nationalism, and the promise to the Bengali Hindus of the Barak Valley to grant citizenship to the Hindu refugees, and so on. So thus, from your reading that chapter, we have an explanation about the electoral success of the BJP in Assam, and also the reasons why the BJP fell out with the local people. Then what happens is that there's a short section at the end of the chapter where you ask your readers to think beyond the perimeters of the nation state. So the clarity that this chapter brings to this much muddled area is brilliant, I would say. Yet somehow, I find myself wondering about the exact nature of the message you seem to be trying to convey. Are you saying, Sanjib, then here I'm provoking you, I completely understand, but I would still like you to explain for the sake of our audience and also for greater clarity. Are you suggesting that the people were well within their rights to support the NRC? Are you suggesting that the central government should honor the terms of the Assam Accord by restricting illegal immigrants after 1971? Or are you suggesting that there should be a reversal to something like the cabinet mission plan of autonomy to states regarding matters such as citizenship, something that you yourself mentioned in the book? Or are you suggesting that we should collectively strive to create something like a confederation? After all, you have pointed out in your references to Willem van Schendel, Malini Shud, and others that international borders are artificial, they're routinely violated. Does this mean that the borders should be allowed to be kept soft within a soft nation state-like arrangement, or should we strive for something more radical? In keeping with what you say, the decolonization of the mind beyond the nation. It's a long question, I'm sorry, but I just thought
Well, look, what I'll do is I'm very aware that a lot of you are students, so I will really keep that in mind, right? I would say, look, don't be scared of imagining bold things, right? Though you don't be stuck with the way the world is. The world changes. World is different, and the world we know is a product of historical circumstances. It could also change, right? So my goal then in the chapter she talked about is this, that to make sense of the whole, the goal was not to NRC. Clearly, the partition was a huge factor of Northeast India's life, right? And this will interest you. Say, I'm not a historian, as you know, even though I read a lot of it now. Years ago, Urvashi Butalia, many of you know her work, she invited me to give a talk on partition. I initially told Urvashi, look, I'm not a historian. I don't know very much about the partition. Now I thank Urvashi because I think everything about Northeast India is about the partition, right? So clearly it shows how it organized knowledge in a way we don't think about it enough. So clearly partition is a big part of the story. It's not surprising why NRC, Citizenship Amendment, all of them, if you think about it, are really Assam is where it begins, right? That tells you how important the area is in terms of how it has shaped all this, right? So clearly, but the fact is, history is never simple, right? You have multiple, and I take local past seriously, right? Meaning, Northeast India's local past, if you like, pasts are not universal. You can just, right? Clearly, local towns have histories, right? It seems to me, as I try to make sense of Northeast India as a whole, not merely Assam, I think of it as one of Asia's last frontier regions. Frontier regions are very similar, right? Next to areas which are very lots of population, a very sparsely populated area, right? So you really have lots of them. So clearly it was a region like that. Otherwise, if it was not a region like that, they wouldn't have a tea plantation. Why don't you have tea plantation in Gujarat? There was no empty land. The idea that, so think of this, plantations are mostly in very remote places. In the middle of India, we have a place called Assam, which has huge tea plantation, or Darjeeling. Clearly, these are really seen as places where you really lots of land is there. You can give land to European tea planters, right? They are plantations, African style. Only later on, it became Indian owned, etc. So think of this whole history. Then colonials thought of this as an empty land. And whenever you think of empty lands in the history, it was not an empty land. So in some ways, one good way of thinking about Northeast India politics of the last 150 years is that locals asserting is not an empty land. Locals asserting their connection to the area against discourses of power, right? That it really, so they say, so whether it is Nagaland, Manipur, in a way, that is the constant theme, right? Asserting it is not an empty land, right? And our histories, we are the people, right? So if you think like that, then clearly the fact that unlike rest of India, who has heard of kind of NRC only now, NRC has been part of the discourse of Assam since Assam movement for sure. Just think for them. Why is it that we are calling updating the National Register of Citizens? Because there is something called the National Register of Citizens, which was there only in Assam. This whole history, which itself is interesting. As early as 1951, some smart census commissioner, Mr. Bhagaiwala, decided, look, this immigration issue is so tricky here, we better have a National Register of Citizens. He never thought it will acquire his life, but clearly we miss all of this. So as a result, Assam is the only place where the question of updating comes. Clearly in 51, nobody thought, the circumstances didn't exist for the NRC to be comprehensive, right? Just imagine even doing a census in Assam is difficult in many areas during floods, right? So it was not intended that way. For a long time, the Indian courts did not even consider NRC to be a document that you can use to prove identity, right? It has become all of that because of Assam movement, etc. So anyway, so my point is that this local history you have to take seriously, right? So in a way, what has happened, it seems to me, with the NRC, National Citizenship Amendment Act, you have a whole Assam-specific politics which got appropriated very recently, right? For its own purposes, BJP's own purposes, right? It was not that. So we have to honor the discourse's autonomy. It really was not that discourse, which has become now. So in terms of how do you solve it, right? I don't have a solution, but it seems to me, if I like to think boldly, if there are parts of the world where people go back and forth without worrying whether you are a citizen or not, just think of this, that in principle, not a person, assume in a person, there are a lot of people, Indians working in Bangladesh, and there are people from Bangladesh working in India. Assume some of them are unauthorized. I don't think they're dying to vote, If I'm perfectly happy if I'm from Bangladesh, I'm working in India, I'm not dying to vote in India. I want to be treated well. If I'm a person from India working in Bangladesh, I'm not dying to vote in Bangladesh. I just want to be treated well like a human being. If that is the problem, why can't we have a situation where your legal citizenship can be in Bangladesh, you still can be working in India, right? Only thing we need is imagination, better way of thinking about these questions. And so the solution exists. Solution exists in the world, right? After all, people in Europe is not superior to us. Why is it that in Europe you can go across borders without people asking for your papers and work and come back, right? Why couldn't India, Bangladesh become like that? What is lacking is imagination. What is lacking is really resources. I think India should be more confident about itself. We are not a nation state. We are well ahead of European Union in terms of how it was such a kind of complex civilization still comes together. If you think boldly, we have solutions. If you constantly are trying to imitate some silly country in Europe, then we don't have solutions, right? So that is the kind of imagination I'm hoping the younger people would have.
The last question before Kairavi comes in, I think, is that, I had somebody saying sometime back, in exasperation, why should Assam be made to bear the burden of partition? Why can't rest of India take the burden of refugees and so on? I mean, why cannot we have some kind of a consensus where the entire country takes, some of the people who have come in? And we were having an interesting, discussion. If I were to ask you if we can have something like this arranged, what would be your comments on a suggestion? This was a suggestion that came from somebody in Assam, saying that, why can't the rest of India be made to take the surplus population? This is a little, I thought that, a treaty should exist, and, some such arrangement should be done. But I was listening, and I just thought I would pass on these comments to you and see what you would have to say about it.
Well, as you know, right, this was really the Assam movement's thing. It was not really a new idea in that sense. Assam movement was saying that, right, that if indeed there is so much immigration, why can't rest of India take the load, right? So, but mind you, on Assam, we have to always be careful. Not every person from Bengal is a really came later. Once you bring in Sylhet, you have to remember Sylhet, Shillong, lots of these people are really from there, right? So in a way, the border changed, but the people didn't really move, right? So in that sense, then Assam is complicated. There's two different stories of Assam partition, right? You have the kind of memory in the Brahmaputra Valley, which is very different from the memory in the Barak Valley, right? Which again goes back to history, right? I think both memories have to be honored. So it seems to me then I would, rather than thinking about really, giving solutions in terms that you are framing, I would much rather that we really think about it even more broadly. There's no particular reason why it seems to me that India and Bangladesh couldn't discuss together, right? So after all, the partition, given how major partition is, clearly these two countries should be in very good position to discuss what can we do on migration. But we can never thought that way, right? But it becomes somehow unimaginable. But I would like that kind of imagination to become possible. I know lots and lots of Bengali Hindus who would love to go to Sylhet, not just as a tourist, may even have roots there, may even have to do more than just visit Sylhet, right? These things are not impossible, right? They are possible, but I think our imagination has to be bold. And I would say that, and rather than thinking constantly in the terms of what these few politicians give you, that is too narrow a framework for intellectuals, right? Intellectuals think more broadly than that. And only when you can imagine a better future, only then you can really come up with good ideas. Otherwise, imagination is beginning, right? You have to imagine it sometimes that this is possible. Only then you can begin to think, what are other ways of doing it, right? And clearly my book, that was not the intention. My book was simply to provoke, to say that, look, if this is what it is, how do we rethink all this? Yeah.
I think I'll let Kairavi is waiting to ask you some questions, and then Joita probably. So I'll stop here with my share. Yes, Kairavi.
Hello. My question
I would like to
is.
see, I don't see Kairavi though. Why don't I see her face?
Kairavi has.
I'm here. Can
you see her now?
Well, it had been nicer if I knew. Anyway, No,
Uh,
I don't see her at all. I mean, I going to my,
um,
anyway, it's all right. I mean, I'll, yeah, go ahead. I can't see her, no.
So my question is from chapter 4, which is on the Naga conflict, where you give a very detailed understanding of the politics revolving around the ongoing negotiation between the National Socialist Council of Nagaland and the Indian government. You also provide us with a glimpse of the formation of the Naga identity from the colonial era. But there you mention about the conversion of people to Christianity, which creates a pan-Naga identity. In this context, I would like to ask that how, in what ways the Christianity plays role in the contemporary Naga claim, and in what way religion is affecting the negotiation process between National Socialist Council of Nagaland and Indian government, and where can we place religion in contemporary Naga identity politics?
Hmm. Well, the good question. So listen, I think that my long-term view would be that, say, we think of the world in terms of, say, major religions like Hinduism, Islam, Jewish, Judaism, Christianity. World, in fact, was full of small religions. It becomes so that the fact that we think only in terms of these major religions tells you about a problem, actually, right? We cannot think about the fact that most of the time through human history, human beings had really minor religions of all kind, right? So in some ways, then there's a wonderful book called Islam and the Bengal Frontier, right? Which is a book about how Bengal became, how Islam came to Bengal. They all had small religions earlier on, right? Some people will say whatever they had before was Hinduism. I think that is really a very imperial way of thinking, in my view. No, they had religions which are very local, right? Just doesn't really include, so it doesn't encompass by our words, our language, which is a very limited language. It has only room for 5 or 6 religions, right? The so-called major religions. So it seems to me, I like to like to think of people with respect. And the minimum I can do for respect is to respect the religions they had before. For me to label it Hinduism or something that they had was really not fair, right? People had, even Northeast India is full of indigenous religions of all kind, right? So clearly then, when Naga, so the fact that, say, many people became Christian became almost central to the idea of Naganess, right? In this sense that, say, in some ways, don't forget that, and it's very hard for sometimes from the rest of India to understand, right? But after all, Christianity also became a kind of an oppositional modernity, right? It comes, missionary schools, etc. Christianity comes. It almost gives you a kind of a way to think about the modern world, right? And the fact that Christianity came from the West obviously is not accidental, right? So clearly that a lot of people, many people I talk to, which I didn't really, I have in the past, I've hesitated to talk about the Christian side of the Naga story. This time, thanks to some very good friends, I have been able to at least say a little bit more. And I'm realizing it is a very central part of it, right? Not because of actively that church plays a role or anything like that. It's just that there's a whole sensibility that Christianity is what makes us modern, right? So in some ways, then just think of this, that the area in Manipur called Ukhrul, right, where there is a Muiva is from there was no Naga movement. But the fact that you were Baptist Christians almost made you really part of this Naga nation. So clearly, there's a very central connection then between the idea that we are Christians. As a Christians, we are a Naga nation, right? Before that, we are something else. And clearly, I think that whether we are anthropologists or political scientists, it doesn't matter, but we need to really think of this seriously. So that is basically what I'm saying. It really, you can't separate it. So in a way, that entire Naga imagination, right, is really, they think of the word Naga nation, right? We can always, as academics say, are they a nation? That's not the point. But the point is simply that Naga nation is a very old idea, starts in the 40s. It is that idea. It will bring all these Nagas together, right? And that's a powerful idea. So to me, it is quite interesting. At one level, you have this NSCN, which is a rebel organization. At another level, Nagaland State Assembly, which is hardly rebel, right? All mainstream politicians. They have at least 5 resolutions, which is pretty much like the NSCNs, that they believe in the integration of Naga areas. So clearly there's something about Naga identity, which is very old, and that is a fairly big amount of consensus. That doesn't mean people disagree. So it seems to me taking that narrative seriously is critical, right? So you can see now it is falling apart, the Naga talks. So I think, why is it falling apart? It seems to me we are not willing to take this discourse more seriously. We think it is just NSCM wants it, the other people don't want it. I think in some ways we think of everything too politically, if you like, right? Because it is not just a factional conflict, it is something deeper, right? So let me sort of shift and give you an example why I think it's useful to think like this. Think about the Mizo Accord. When you think about the Mizo Accord, now we think of Mizoram as a place where things were settled. But if you study the Mizo movement, you realize that Mizo movement was not about Mizoram. There are Mizos in Burma, Mizos in Manipur, right? So clearly we put together something, as a result we have peace, but in some ways Manipur is not peaceful, right? One can say Mizo Accords, other side of the Mizo Accord is a non-peaceful Manipur. Other side of the Mizo Accord is a non-peaceful Burma. Why can't we think like that? So the accords, quickly to put together an accord so that you have a state and then everybody is happy, sounds wonderful, not in the long term. So it seems to me the Naga movement provides us a wonderful opportunity to think of these things in a very long-term way. And part of it is to take their beliefs, their worldview seriously. So only in that sense, I can say, I can't sound more than, I didn't grow up as a Christian, but it seems to me if the more we take seriously that Christianity is a big part of Naga identity, we would benefit, right? And not in the sense of some conspiracy that church is a big player, not like that. It's just a part of their historical sense of being, if you like.
So,
Thank you.
yeah, I mean, it's a little odd, Sanjib, that the Kaplang faction should not be consulted at all. And I'm also wondering what happens to the Naga demands for sovereignty. How do you really reconcile that with the notion of sovereignty of the Indian Union? And, it's a little odd whether it will succeed or not, as you very correctly point out. But maybe we can come back to this later on once Joyita is waiting to ask a question. Joyita, will you please unmute yourself? I think.
Hello. Hopefully I'm audible.
Yes, I can hear you. Yeah.
And I'm not sure if I'm visible, but I will.
No, you are visible. You are visible.
Great. So first of all, thank you so much for this interaction. I broadly have two questions. And the first one is really regarding the viability of secession of the Northeast from mainland India.
What? Sorry, really repeat
Secession. So you've talked a lot about the security anxieties that have plagued the Northeast since almost the colonial times. And we've also talked about the sort of systematic othering of the Northeast and the almost internal orientalization that happens of that region through race, through religion, through law, that all serve to sort of constitute the Northeast as India's other. You also sort of examined the relatively porous boundaries between the Northeast and Bangladesh that have perhaps been almost antithetical to how we might normally conceptualize a post-colony, in that a post-colony needed to have some notion of a walled sovereignty with stringent border control that served to almost reinforce the nation's territorial integrity. So my first question then is really in light of all of this, how do you redress the anomaly that might be the Northeast, right? How do you negotiate between, at one hand, needing to maintain some sort of territorial integrity, perhaps as a nation state, but at the same time championing, say, something like self-determination or sovereignty, which are again terms that we would attribute to a modern post-colonial nation state like India, perhaps. So should states then be allowed to secede? And on what grounds then is secession mandated by international law? For example, would international law favor territorial integrity with the parent state? So in that sense, why would something like secession be necessary? Or alternatively, why is some amount of territorial integrity needed in such a sort of imagination? Yeah.
Look, very good question. But let me start with the good news. Good news is that when I talk to people who are in these rebel movements in Northeast, very few people want to secede. Right? So, which is interesting to me, right? So in a way that is very funny to me. That just think, we have created a situation where 10 people can have a group, call themselves the liberation movement of this. Officially, then they will say we are demand secession or separate. But we are scholars, we are intellectuals. Does it mean they really want to secede? Or is it a 10 group of people? Are they really serious? Clearly, I think we don't even ask these basic questions. Right, which is interesting. So in a way, it seems like nobody is asking for secession. It will be one way of thinking about it, right? So then it's even more interesting. Why on earth we are creating this mess? Nobody's asking for it yet. So clearly we need some different kind of explanation. It seems to me that when I look at look, there are some more stronger movements than others, but on the whole, it seems to me the way I make sense of these movements, they're not really insurgency in the sense of, say, when you think of counterinsurgency, you really think of these powerful movements, right? Against which really against which you have the whole state. I think really we just got used to using the word insurgency, but now these are really sometimes 10 people groups, sometimes 15 people group. How have they survived? They survive precisely because of ties with the mainstream, right? Meaning that whether mainstream politicians, mainstream business, they all know each other. Insurgency movements are not like that. We just are getting used to a discourse and we keep using it, right? Without thinking, without asking basic questions. So it seems to me the fact, going back down to my historical point, that Northeast India's sovereignty was very different, very uneven, right? As a result, state was not there in the big way. That is producing this peculiar situation where there are tons of insurgencies and we quote unquote insurgency. But I would say I don't even like to use the word insurgency. I meet them. I don't think any of them look like a real threat or wants to really separate from India. There's that. I don't see any of that. Very little of that here and there. So it's almost as if there's a kind of discursive use of secession, if you want to use your term. It's a kind of an interesting discourse, right? But take it as discourse. You see their practice, they really don't mean it. Even something like, say, what was very interesting to me about the Mizo movement, I try to make sense of it. Do you know that the Mizo record started, Mizo rebellion, and the leaders really tried to call those people back because they thought they shouldn't do it, right? And it was fascinating to me, right? It is only because the communication was so bad, the people who were sent out to different villages to start a rebellion couldn't be called back. And those to me are very interesting facts, right? And I knew that because there was a PhD thesis I was part of, and I thought it was a fascinating little fact. But what has happened in India, I think it seems to me that we don't do research deeply enough. We never really look at the importance of these facts, right? So in some ways, then one can argue, even the Mizo insurgency was an unintended insurgency, right? To be provocative, right? So clearly we are creating these situations without knowing whether people really want to have that. So my bold assertion would be that I don't see anybody wanting to secede, right? But the secessionist discourse is alive and well. So the question is, why is the secessionist discourse alive and well? Even look, I've quoted a very military guy. The military guy says it's there because the moment you say secession, people run to you and give you some money, right? And I quote it. And so I'm saying that's not the only intention, but we really can't just go by repeating the same thing. There's a huge separatist movement. They all want to separate. No, I think it is what has happened. It has become so, we haven't been able to get out of this mindset, right? And so once we get bolder, look, one thing, don't forget, one thing Armed Forces Special Powers Act, it really is, what it does is that it discourages creative thinking. It discourages creative solution, right? So, and I like to think of it. So it seems to me like, let's think of the example of United Liberation Front of Assam. I look at very, very carefully what happens. So it seems to me that nobody thought before the time that they declared that ULFA as illegal or whatever, and had the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, November 1990. Nobody really thought about it as an insurgency movement. Right? They knew people in the government, right? Assam Gana Parishad, they all started with the Assam movement. As a result, ULFA was not seen as a huge threat. Suddenly, we have a military discourse, it becomes a threat to the Indian state. So I actually reject that. So I introduce in my idea, I use the term contentious politics, right? It's a whole theoretical way. I really think of contentious politics, which asserts this connection between rebels, mainstream, right? Much of Northeast's politics is about that kind of a connection. They're all connected. They're not really insurgency in the sense of separate from the mainstream, right? So look, all of these are just simply provocations, beginnings. I don't have an answer to all your question, right? All I'm saying is that your point is well taken. Legally, clearly, you're raising some legal questions. Clearly, the United Nations within our current framework, it is impossible to think outside of the idea of territorial integrity, right? But it seems at the same time, it's certainly possible to go beyond territorial integrity, if you like, by having good relationship with your neighbor, right? Territorial integrity, but nothing stops us from having fantastic relationship, fantastic soft borders, right? With Burma or Bangladesh, right? But I think all of that is doable, right? And don't underestimate the kind of dysfunctionality of things like Armed Forces Special Powers Act. You essentially have a military mindset by which you think. whatever, right? I use the word is almost like a kind of a very military metaphor. Politics is not military, maybe wonderful for some things. They're not very good at analyzing politics. But yet, moment we have armed forces special powers, like everybody seems to see these political movements through military lenses, right? And I'm inviting people not to do that. And I'm giving one way out. I think the contingent politics way by which I look at Armed Forces Special Powers Act, which really looks at each point seriously, right? That they're really movements which are in dialogue with a larger audience. They're in dialogue with the government, dialogue with a larger audience. All of that has produced this, let's call it a mess, right? It's an unintended mess we have created in the Northeast, will be my quick way of putting it. Yeah.
I did have a second question, and it was actually, it was again regarding the inner line permit, and you've sort of touched upon this before, but if you could just clarify, you've talked about the demand to perhaps extend the inner line to other parts of the Northeast, and you've sort of, what I found interesting in that particular passage was, this was actually an idea that was being rallied by Northeasterners as a means to almost systematically other the ethnic majority of India by deeming them sort of quote unquote outsiders and preventing them from perhaps laying claim to the Northeast politically. So what was interesting there was there seems to be I can't find a better term for this, the role reversal where the othering is happening from those in positions of subalternity perhaps. So in that sense, my question is, for people who would be in favor of the inner line, why would someone want to persist with the inner line permits, right? Wouldn't you agree that the inner line system, the inner line permit system serves to sort of increase the gulf between the Northeast and the rest of India?
Look, I think that, as you know, nobody, but I see all this not as a part of really intended action. As I said earlier on, essentially we continued all the colonial institutions like inner line precisely because of a political incapacity, not because of capacity, right? Precisely because it became very clear with the Naga movement that really there is no way you can really reform these indirect rule arrangements immediately, right? But we left it at that, right? We never thought what are the consequences of leaving these institutions, which are meant for completely different purposes, right? And they're going to be huge consequences. They're not meant for a modern kind of state like India. They're not created for modern conditions. So they're having a series of dysfunctional effects, right? And so, but not intended. But what has happened is, mind you, what is interesting in politics is that we are always stuck with the institutions we have. They're familiar, right? So we ask for demand based on the familiar institutions. So obviously, if you recognize the fact that Northeast India was seen as an empty area, people just come, right, in huge numbers, not merely from West Bengal, from Bihar. Essentially, you would say as early as the 1901 census, I think, you already have a major percentage of the population who are not from there. Right? It's really like it's very interesting in that sense. It really like, I think that more creative people, so younger people, should really compare Assam with places like Fiji, Mauritius, right? Because we are, after all, it's a very similar plantation economy, exactly at the same time, right? So believe it or not, a person of Chotanagpur, when he signed and decided he'll go to Assam, he wasn't sure he was going to Assam. It could have been Mauritius, could have been Fiji. It happened to be Assam, right? So in a way, it's amazingly interesting history. So coming back to your point then, so it seems to me now clearly nobody, I don't think Indian government wants to abolish the inner line, right? Clearly they worry. In fact, inner line is what keeps Arunachal peaceful, right? We clearly have created a situation now. Not only we don't want to really disturb the inner line, and we are also expanding the inner line, right? And think about the idea of the sixth schedule. Sixth schedule, again, now is a contemporary Indian term. Earlier term was what? Excluded area. Even British didn't think excluded area could be used in places in the plains. They were really thought only very far away place, very remote, it works. Now we are expanding it. What else do you call it but lack of political imagination? Doesn't mean you can suddenly withdraw it and tell bit clearly. That's not easy either, but our discussion has to be different. Right? Right? So that we at least have to have an agenda. These are colonial institutions which have lots of dysfunctionalities, right? But that discussion doesn't take place. Why doesn't it take place? Everything becomes insurgency. Talk to some insurgent group, have peace, right? Whatever peace you want to have, you call it peace, right? It's not really serving anybody, right? It seems to me, all I'm saying is that discussion that didn't happen in 47, right? And mind you, not just about Northeast Pacific. Many people like Sudipta Kobiraj would argue that what has happened in nationalism was this enormous new political imagination, right? And at the same time, you inherited the colonial state. Colonial state was really a colonial state. It was not meant to be a state of a post-colonial nation, right? So a lot of colonial institutions continued, right? And yet we immediately thought it's okay, right? From the Indian police, think about the problems that we have with the Indian police. Partly because after a while, it became impossible to reform it, right? But in a way, I would say colonials themselves will be amazed by how we have kept these institutions, right? So inner line is only an extension of it, if you like. A whole set of colonial era institutions introduced for very different purposes. Because we never worked on changing the political imagination, now we think entirely about the world through those lenses. The political demands also takes that form, and the government also tries to solve problems within that language.
Yeah. Thank